because man's task is to make the earth after the model of heaven. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Man's project is to heavenize the earth. Man is made to transform the world from glory to glory, to take hold of it and break it down and remake it after the image of heaven.
Welcome back to the Reformed Reset. My name is Grant, and not with my weaker vessel. Again, I have the great privilege of doing another interview with a very special guest, Michael Foster. Michael Foster, how you doing?
Doing well. Good morning.
Guys, remember, we're part of Take Hold Studios, so go to takeholdstudios.com. Subscribe to the YouTube channel right now. Hit the like button, do all that kind of stuff. And especially on this episode, I share this with your friends. I think this is going to be just extremely helpful and practical on a very important topic in living Christianly in our day and age right now. Again, in podcast world, subscribe, leave a review, do all that stuff, guys, to help us reach new listeners. So get that stuff out of the way. Michael, again, thanks for coming on. Would you please give everybody a quick background of yourself so they can get a little more familiar?
Sure. Well, I'm from the Midwest. I grew up mostly in Indiana, became a Christian in my late teens, 17. I grew up in a kind of a weird blended upbringing. I lived with my grandmother for a while, who came over to the States after World War II. And she was like Jewish ethnically, but went to a Lutheran church like every once a quarter, mostly because there was German immigrants that went to that church, and she wanted to connect with people from the old country. And then I grew up with my mom and dad as well, who probably would have told you they were Christians if you asked them when I was a boy, but didn't go to church almost ever, and had a deep interest in the paranormal and the occult, just in the books they read and the movies they watched. And so I grew up around a lot of that stuff. And so when you're kind of bouncing from house to house and having all these different traditions and religions thrown at you as if they're the plot of a movie or a book, you kind of think of them as just a myth, like a helpful myth, a way to communicate ideas. And that's pretty much what I thought all religions were. And I had my biology teacher undo evolution for me, like at least macroevolution. And I just couldn't believe it because he was a manly guy. He was our reserve football coach and our middle school wrestling coach. He had two of his sons were well-known athletes years before there, but they held all sorts of records. And he was not only a tough man, but an intelligent man as well. And clearly believed in God, which I was an atheist. I didn't believe in God. I don't think ever growing up. I just thought it was fake. So then him and this other girl in one of my art classes started to kind of like share aspects of the truth of Scripture with me. And I became a Christian when I went to some sort of like a basketball tournament, and this guy preached the gospel and scales fell off my eyes and I was saved. And it started, things changed pretty quick. I got more serious in my studies. I started to attend a church. I was in the charismatic church for about a year and a half. And I read 1 Corinthians 12 through 14. I was like, what's going on here? And then I also got in trouble. I was a junior high youth leader, youth pastor there. And I taught that women couldn't be pastors because that's what I went through 1 Timothy, what it clearly hadn't read the Bible before. It was my first time through. And one of our pastors at that church was a woman, and her daughter was in there. Well, my mom's a pastor. I was like, well, I guess she shouldn't be. Right. And so then I ended up in the Calvary Chapel movement for many years, which is kind of,
I was raised Calvary Chapel.
Yeah, it can be a little anti-intellectual at times and simplistic, but they love the Bible. They love evangelism. And so I was in that for a long time. And served as a youth pastor and kind of as an assistant pastor. And it was good. It was good for me. Did a lot of evangelism, a lot of outreach, led a lot of huge youth group gatherings, like 100 some kids would come to these things. And then I became reformed slowly, just through in Calvary Chapel. Expository preaching is a big deal, even though it's more of a read and ramble approach that they have than I would say true exegetical preaching, at least in many cases. But they turned me on to Martin Lloyd-Jones. So I read his book on preaching, and then I read MacArthur's Master Seminary put a book out called Rediscovering Expository Preaching. And there's a chapter on that with famous preachers. And he kind of went through and listed a bunch of them. And I just went and bought their books and read them. And one of those was John Calvin. Now, I early on in my faith was reading the church fathers, starting with Augustine. It was the first Christian book I ever read was Augustine's Confessions. But so that's how I became reformed, through just reading sermons of reformed guys. I didn't even know I was reformed. I had no clue. I was actually anti-Calvinist. And then someone's like, "You are a Calvinist." I was like, "Oh, all right, well, there you have it." So then I started to see the problems with churches. Just that, in the early days, we were doing all these outreaches, and I ran a skateboard outreach ministry with some friends that got kind of big for about 2 years. And we'd have like 500 kids show up, and some get saved and their lives would be totally changed. It was amazing. And we did all the street preaching stuff. So to us, the church was always an exciting place, and all these cool things were happening. But it was really because that stuff was just happening with us. As that stuff calmed down and we got into the actual life of most local churches, it was clear there wasn't much evangelism. It was clear that they couldn't reach men. And I was starting to get really bothered by how I had to apologize for things at my church a lot of times, for how it came across, how you feel like you're walking into the women's bathroom at a Hobby Lobby at most churches. And that the preaching was generally apologetic, not in the good sense, not in the like defending the faith, but almost like sorry for the hard things that God says. And a friend of mine had just come back from Seattle, and I was talking to him about some of my concerns and telling him I was thinking about church planting. Church planting was really big in the Calvary Chapel movement. And so it was a common thing to think about as a young man in that movement. But he told me about this guy up in Seattle that was talking about all that stuff. That was Driscoll. And so that's how I got connected to Mark and X29. I went through their church planting boot camp and all that, and evaluations at Chandler's church, and then got approved to go plant a church. So I did. I planted a church in downtown Cincinnati. Really, it's called Uptown. It's right by University of Cincinnati in the Gaslight District. And planted a church for about 3 years, but I was in my early 20s. And the more I got into it, I realized I did not have what it was going to take to raise these men who were just a few years younger than me or around the same age into mature manhood. Right? It was like pretty difficult to be a father to men when you haven't been very well fathered yourself and you're just starting your family. Right. So I eventually folded that church plant into another church plant that still exists today, and took a few years off. Ended up going through seminary, officially becoming a Presbyterian, and was in the PCA for about 5.5 years, something like that. And then when I moved back home to Cincinnati, I went without call and stayed in my Southern Presbytery, Calvary. But up here in the Cincinnati area, a lot of the churches kind of fall to wokeism, to Black Lives Matter. And I didn't really want to be in a presbytery where I would immediately have to start fighting with men that are supposed to be on my team in the trenches with me. You don't want to turn your guns on each other. So you're allowed to stay without call for a couple of years in a presbytery that you don't geographically live. So that I had permission to do that for my presbytery. And I took that time to think, like, what's next? Do I really want a church plant again? Do we really want to do this? And so we thought about it. We thought about it for a while, and everything that was going on with COVID really motivated us towards church planting. So I started talking to Greg Strawbridge in Augustine Presbytery of the CREC. I considered a lot of denominations because it's funny. I was in the fringe in the PCA, and I'm kind of in the fringe in the CREC too. Right. I'm not really a paedo-communist. I would say generically we have covenant renewal worship in a very generic sense, but certainly not in a Jeff Meyer sense. There's a lot of things I differ on that are kind of key things that you hear a lot. But what I liked about the CREC is they were Reformed Catholics in the sense that they held to Reformation doctrine, and they held to there was a breadth of willingness to bring people in that were on the same page when it came to the core of that doctrine.
Right.
And so while there is a lot of kind of Anglican leaning stuff you run into in the CREC, there's kind of more of an independent reform mindset at times. And then there's a few of us that are more Southern Presbyterian in our leading. That's where I fall. But it was a good talking to Greg and working through those different issues and seeing what was possible, and finding out that I could be in there and work around those things. And it's been a great blessing. So we planted East River as a mission church of All Saints Presbyterian. We've been at it for about 14, 15 months now. And I think we were like 220 people last week. We've installed 3 elders. We've got 3 deacon in training candidates that we hope to have ordained, assuming everything goes well. By end of the year, we signed a long-term lease for a 12,500 square foot building.
Nice. And
just kind of plugging ahead. In terms of my personal life, I'm married to Emily. We've been married 19 years this summer. We've had 8 children together, 4 girls, 4 boys, 1 girl's in heaven. And I've got a 15-year-old, a 13-year-old, 11-year-old, 9-year-old, a 7-year-old, a 4-year-old, and a new one. That's like, I don't know how old, 18 months, something like that.
Praise God. Cool. And then, as you guys have seen, I have it perfectly placed. I'm so good at product placement. You've recently come out with a book with a friend of yours, Dominic Tennant.
Yep.
And It's Good to Be a Man. So I know this book grew out of, or is kind of the product of a ministry, a podcast, website sort of thing that you've had. So how did that ministry start? You kind of already shared that your concern that just sort of welled up in you was men and trying to get men into the church. I don't know if maybe that's just exactly what it is that spawned this ministry, but could you tell us a little bit about how this podcast and website and everything began?
So I've always had an interest in human sexuality, just the differences between men and women, how it plays out in film and poetry and books and biologically. It really kind of goes back to, I think, being raised up on the church fathers who talks about bodily realities way more than modern evangelicals do. And then also sitting through sociology and anthropology classes in my undergrad and really being captivated and thinking about that. Then I would take like feminist literature classes. My undergrad is history and English, and read feminists. I was reading radical feminists when I was like 19 and didn't believe any of it because it was all so crazy, but I thought it was fascinating. Right. So I've always had an interest in all that stuff and have had a habit of reading the latest studies. I mean, since I was 19, so going 23 years now. So that was a big deal to me. And then in my own early marriage, we had problems that we had to work through. Just because we were both really first generation Christians. Emily grew up in a Roman Catholic home that was pretty serious Roman Catholic. So it wasn't like they didn't go to mass or anything. They did, but I don't know how deeply understood their faith was.
Right.
But she did grow up in that. I grew up in what I've already described to you. So it was a rough go trying to establish a first generation Christian home. So that's where I started reading. I remember I read Recovering Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, and I was like, I hate this book. I hated it, man. It was so wordy. There was a couple of good chapters here and there, but I remember thinking like it was all about a defense against feminism. Like that was what it was mostly on. And I didn't care. Like I didn't like, yeah, feminism's false. Okay, now what? Right. And I didn't really walk away with much. Then I don't know how I got a hold of Reforming Marriage. But around the same time, I got a hold of Reforming Marriage in the early 2000s. And it must have just came out. I think it came out like 2001 or something. This must have been 2004.
Okay.
So anyhow, I read that and I was like, oh, finally a book that's helpful. And so I used that for marriage counseling on my first church plant and started to think through some of those concepts early on. And I've never called myself a complementarian. I've always thought, well, no, I'm not. I don't subscribe to that. I'm not. I'm just biblical sexuality, which believes in patriarchalism and as defined by the Bible. So that's kind of like all a background. I've always been in that world. But a couple of years ago, I started noticing that a lot of young men were increasingly effeminate, and the ones that weren't effeminate were still struggling to get married, to relate to women, to get their careers going. And maybe not all those attributes were present in one man, but many of those attributes were. And I would give them advice because they would ask for it. Because I used to be a youth pastor, had a lot of these young people coming to me that were now in their mid to later 20s, even early 30s, asking me for advice. And I would give them advice and it wouldn't work. And I'd get frustrated. And so your tendency is to think, well, they're just losers, right? They're making a bunch of excuses and not following through on it. But there was too many of them. And the things they were saying were too consistent across the board. And I started hearing them talking about guys like Jordan Peterson. And I watched one of his things and I wasn't into it. And I kind of moved on. But he kept coming up. So then as all this was going on, I decided, well, let's just do a deep dive. Let's do a deep dive into all these guys. Why are these Christians listening to pagan Jungian psychologists? Now I know that Peterson these days is moving closer and closer to biblical Christianity, but that wasn't the case then at all. And then they also were listening to kind of like dating coaches and pickup artists. And I was like, what in the world? What is going on here? So at the time I was only part-time in the ministry and I had my own business. Well, I sold a lot of mixed media, comic books, records, that sort of stuff. And while I packed this stuff up to ship it, I just sit there and listen. So I listened to a couple 100 hours of Peterson, 100 hours of pickup artists, 100 hours of anti-feminists. These are like women, like Karen Strong is one, who are against it. Then I tried to find good Christian podcasts on it, and there weren't any. I couldn't find, most of them are like some sermon series, or it was the same sort of boomer stuff, that worked for a world prior to the third wave feminism winning, the internet, pornography, dating apps, cell phones, personalized screens. It all changed so much. And it's really hard, I think, for our older generation to understand how much has been lost, And so a lot of it wasn't helpful at all. It was the same sort of bad advice that I was parroting back to people. And so as I got into all that, reading about the red pill, which is this basic idea, the red pill has a couple of different applications. So obviously from the movie The Matrix, if the blue pill, you stay in the lie, the red pill, you wake up and face the difficult reality. So anyhow, the red pill was like kind of a political, sometimes they applied it that way, where it referred to waking up to see that, that conservatives really aren't conservatives or whatever. But it also was applied to human sexuality, where you started to see how women actually work, how men actually work, and the dynamic between the two. So I read a lot of that stuff and I got on Twitter just to read and interact, because I found out that they were mostly in YouTube, Twitter, and at the time a little bit on Reddit. And so as I got in all that, there's like, I started to see why these men were going there, because these guys are giving them actual practical strategies that worked at some level. A lot of it was kind of a short-term sexual strategy, like to
Mhm.
get a girl to like you, to respond to you, maybe to even have sex with you, like fornicate.
Right.
But they were discovering creational realities that they were referring to. And that's why these guys were going there. And the church was not talking about it at all. And so that is where I started to put together a Facebook page called It's Good to Be a Man. And from there, it kind of it grew. And I met my friend Non-Tenet. We had known each other through debating about the sons of God. I think they're people because they're people, but he doesn't agree. But I found out he was reading and thinking about a lot of the same things. And so we started the podcast together, and out of that grew a book and a website, and lots of articles and lots of interviews. And then my Twitter grew, and I started to go speak at both Christian and non-Christian conferences about the truth of God as it relates to men, and use it as an opportunity to forward the gospel. So yeah. So that's how that started.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I've benefited a lot from, the podcast. I know your strategy with the podcast is sort of just put out something when inspiration strikes, and but it's,
I don't have any respect for those standard. Everyone, like, the only way you can do it, you got to do it every week, and there can never be. It's always going to be high quality, and there can't be any typos. And I was like, well, I guess it's going to be a small, because I don't care. It's
that's funny.
The good is the enemy of the mediocre. So I think if you're speaking to the needs of the day in a compelling way, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, they're going to overlook the apostrophe that, or whatever.
Or whatever, yeah.
So, it's funny. You mentioned two things popped in my head. This red pill thing that happens where you sort of wake up to the overall, I know it's called like the feminine imperative, right? The feminization of our whole culture, which, you can point to the COVID response, right? We pointed to the caretakers for the answer in society, the mothers, in a sense. Why? Because our culture is feminized. But the church being scared to go to all these people that you're mentioning, Peterson and others, for insight, and I know their answer would probably be, well, it's not Christian, so why would we ever go there? Yet the church more and more has gone to pagan psychology and psychiatry and that sort of thing for insight on parenting, relationships, right? They adopt alcoholism, or they adopt a lot of terminology that the pagans use for, it's a disease and this and that. But it's, as you're talking, I'm thinking, well, why do they pull insight there but not this other one? It's because that's a caretaker that has a feminine aspect to it in its service, I guess. And so it's pervasive. The feminization of our culture is pervasive.
Yeah.
So
but there's also dishonesty too, is that the reason they're okay with that is because it's not speaking to the issue of sexuality directly. And people are fine with quoting pagan sources, right? That's where do they learn math from? They learn math from, right? Like a bunch of Greeks is where it comes from. And so anyhow, I think it's because they don't want to talk. They're actually have imbibed feminism, and they don't want us to talk about these issues.
So talk a little bit about the reception of the book. I think maybe, I don't know what has surprised you or not with the reception now that the book's been out for a little bit.
I thought it was going to do okay. Because of the sort of interest we had been getting, I thought it would do fine. I didn't think it would do as good as it's done. It's done really good. And it's reaching so many people. It's wild. And And we wrote it and promoted it specifically to reach a broad crowd. I wasn't really interested in just selling to Canon's normal people or trying to or just reach this small crowd or whatever. The book's it's a strange book, like where we pull from things, the way we order things and explain it. Someone asked me, so who's your audience? Trying to figure out. I'm like, well, anyone that's eyes have been open to need to grow as a man, really. And well, I mean, obviously we write for a Christian audience, but we wanted to write in a way that would actually be even compelling to people there's a lot of people right now that are considering Christianity in a way that they hadn't before. A lot of men are, because there's kind of an interest in traditionalism, an interest in the ancient ways. You see this all over, they call it trad cons, and some of it's aesthetics, and not the actual beliefs, right? But nonetheless, it's got a lot of people that are opened up to it. And so we wanted to write a book that was quotable, that was pithy, that was shareable, that would work in a time like ours. And I think that's helped it take off. And it's speaking to, and the other thing is, we did a lot of research. Like, I was talking to a pretty well-known author, and he said what a lot of the ideas in there are ones that he had written about before, but he thought that what we did really well is getting to the psychology of men. Well, the reason that happened is that in the lead up to it, I did hundreds of hours of phone counseling and in-person counseling with men and talking to them about their issues. These are guys, young guys that wanted to get a girl and were struggling for various reasons, or guys going through a terrible divorce or on the verge of divorce, or divorcees trying to put their life back together. And it gave us a lot of insight to the things that the church isn't addressing or addressing maybe poorly. And so we tried to work that into the book, and it's been just cool to see how it's resonating with a lot of people and helping. Like, our goal is for our book to be laissez-faire, to be outdated. That is our goal. We said in the beginning, we didn't want to write a timeless book. We wanted to write a timely one. And I hope a decade from now, someone goes back and says, wow, you had to write this back then. You know what I mean? That's good. I want us to move forward. And I've tried really hard to support and encourage other people starting podcasts and writing books and articles on masculinity, because I think we need to have multiple voices coming from it from multiple different perspectives, kind of decentralize the whole thing. Our voice, our personality, our approach might not land for everybody. And there's another way for it. But so it's cool to see other people even take our book. I see people reuse my content without giving me credit. And I kind of don't care, man. I kind of like, it's for, if it helps men and moves it forward, I didn't create anything new. I mean, I think we dealt with some issues differently than they had been dealt with the last couple of decades. Right. We tried not to fall into the egalitarian versus complementarian paradigm, which has led to nothing. Right. But all our ideas are just old ideas. So I'm happy that it's taken off and spreading all around and inspiring other people.
Yeah, it's awesome. And I think it's the same old stuff, but language changes, rhetorical tactics change, and nuance to the perennial problems is what happens. And so, just like you said, now we're dealing with dating apps, we're dealing with smartphones and stuff like that. That wasn't the case in the 80s, when I think rediscovering biblical manhood, I think it was 80s, maybe
late 90s. And so the Danvers statements in the late 80s, I think.
Okay. And
then that's what CBMW comes out of. And then I think in the mid to late 90s is when the Blue Book came out.
Yeah. And that, I think that's probably one of the faults of that one, is it's not an easy read. It's very technical and very small font and a lot of footnotes, and it's hard to read. I have not read the whole thing. I bought it, started to read it, and then it lost interest pretty quick. Reforming Marriage, on the other hand, the book you brought up, Doug Wilson's book, that was couldn't put it down. That was, and it's not a huge book, but just the way that he presented these truths was awesome. So if a guy is struggling, and so like I grew up with a dad who worked, he was home. We were a Christian family. There's like much to be praised. However, growing up and realizing that I was lacking in the just being confident in masculine traits or whatever it was, and then by default you fall into what the culture is telling you to be like, be the nice guy, be the, you know, whatever, bend, you know, be the doormat for the woman, and then she'll like you and she'll be your girlfriend. And then that doesn't work and you're like, what the heck's going on? And then you find some of this, you know, material, kind of wake up to this, you go, okay, this, yes, this is resonating and answering the frustration that I have. Have you found in all the counseling an issue between like assent and application? Like, okay, I got this, but then how do I work this out? And then along with that, do you find, and this is just something I've been curious about, that maybe men are afraid to apply some of this stuff because they're afraid of becoming the bad patriarch type guy? Like they're afraid I'm going to do more damage than good if I start trying to implement some of this stuff.
So there is a disconnect. So what there's a couple of tendencies that you see in guys these days. One is that they think figuring everything out in their head, once they get all the pieces in place in their head, it'll like flip a switch or something. And that is not what's going to happen. And so you'll have these guys that have incredible, like they've really thought through sexuality, sometimes even more than I have. They'll have all these really complicated labels, sigma male, alpha male, beta male, delta male. You know, they'll have this real crazy socio-sexual hierarchy that they've constructed, or this pill and that pill, you know, the white pill, black pill, red pill, purple pill, blue pill. They think through all this sort of stuff. They're really concerned about women's suffrage, or why wouldn't polygamy be okay? You know, they'll these things that are a little further away from any sort of actionable step, you know. You know, I can tell you, like, when I've dealt with polygamy, in all but one case, like with the conversation around it, it has been single guys. And I'm like, why are you worried about 2 wives when you don't have one?
Can't
you
get
know,
one.
this is weird, man. But I think it's like, if I understand it all, then it'll make sense and I can do it right. Like there's a risk aversion where they don't want to make a mistake. And that's what I think they're trying to do. They're trying to lay a path forward that's certain. But part of manhood is risk. Part of manhood is going out there and taking that risk,
right?
And separating from your mother, and not identifying with her as your example. Because that's one thing that's different between girls and boys. Is a boy has to, at the beginning, all babies cling to their moms, natural. But there's some point that the boy has to remove himself from his mother and start to become like his father. And that requires a separation. You'll see boys entering the world of men that can get really disrespectful towards their mother. You see this a lot in homeschool families, where as they hit the double digits, they start getting very oppositional towards mom. And what's going on there is they don't want to be her. They don't want to be under her authority. They want to become a man. They want to be under men. They want to join the world of men. So you got to be really careful in how you deal with that, because they can't disrespect their mother. That's wrong.
Right.
But you have to also recognize what's going on in their brain, right? They're trying to enter. And so we used to have your bar mitzvah at 12, or you used to go kill a buffalo or stick spikes through. There used to be all these rites of passages, and they don't really exist anymore. And that's problematic for becoming a man. And so these guys grew up without a rite of passage. They grew up sometimes with a father that was distant or not present at all. And they never really firmly entered the world of men. And they don't know how to do it. And so that's why they're either effeminate or macho. Effeminate is this kind of, they have the attributes of a woman, which is fine in a woman, but repulsive in a man. Macho is where they've looked at media, Twitter, streamer like YouTube streamers or whatever, and they say, oh, that's what a man is, and they kind of mimic it. But since it's not well-rounded and they haven't seen it close up and they haven't, seen a moral version of it, it can come off as this sort of grow a beard, spit, smoke, kill things, be a punk, fight. Yeah, whatever. It can just be this macho bravado that doesn't proceed from actual masculinity. And so they're struggling, trying to figure out who they are. And they just don't know how to become a man, because manhood is 80% taught, 20% taught. And you just got to throw yourself into life. You got to go out there. And so what I tell people, I give them the bike chain metaphor. When your bike chain falls off, you put it around one gear, and then you get one of the teeth on one of the other gear, and then you start to turn the pedals. When you turn the pedals, it pops the chain on, right? Mm-hmm. And that's how masculinity is like, look, you don't have to have the whole chain on, right? You got to get it on one tooth and start taking action, start doing these, moving forward, and things will start falling in place, and it'll make more and more sense. And in the beginning, when you start doing anything, it's like when you first start preaching, you might have a preacher voice. I remember listening to this one guy, every time he would talk about the Lord, he said, God. And he never said God like that in person. It was like a preacher voice. It was very weird. And then you kind of like find your way you actually talk and preach that's more natural, just through doing it. Like there's only, you can't read a homiletics book and just become a preacher, a good preacher by homiletics. You got to get some reps in. It's that way with everything. When you first start talking to girls, when you first start like dressing good, like guys start to learn that there's a certain level of self-respect that's expressed through how you dress. And then you'll start dressing nicer, and maybe you'll dress too nice. It sticks out. It makes you the focal point in a room. And then people are going to make fun of you, right? Well, the answer is not to become a slob, but to learn how to dress appropriate to the situation. And so I do think guys are scared of messing up and being laughed at or whatever. Mm-hmm. But you're just going to have to take it, or you're going to be a different type of joke. So.
Yeah. With that right there, just the risk taking, it's like there's this lie they're believing that, I will never recover from this, and it's just, you can recover. For a lot of people Absolutely. In the world, even maybe the same person, you can recover from that. And, it's good. As popular as this topic is right now, and even hopefully it continues to gain steam and we can recover some, good biblical masculinity in our culture. You see those insane conferences being put on with, I can't remember the name. It's like Alpha Conference or something ridiculous.
Oh yeah. That was not a beard in the crowd. That was a weird one. It was like all these white bread looking guys.
Yeah, so. That's like dirt bikes and flames and some like karate guy. It's anyway, like you said, it's kind of the machismo, bravado stuff, burping, farting, just being whatever.
Yep.
Something that was really helpful, and you can just riff off this, I guess, but and I tried to communicate this with my son, and actually Rites of Passage. I'd love to hear your thoughts on modern day Rites of Passage. But Doug Wilson says authority flows to those who take responsibility, and then he says masculinity is the glad assumption of sacrificial responsibility. And then I've heard him say these are all just kind of string together with the man who sacrificed himself and then became king of the whole world. Remember, he's sitting on his throne, and his crown is a crown of thorns. Do you have any thoughts on that, or like that?
Well, Christ was king before he sacrificed himself. So I think here's how I would frame it. What was the purpose of the sacrifice? Was it to get a woman? No, that's not what Ephesians 5 says. Like, the greater point there is to present her to himself, right? To redeem her to himself for the glory of God. And so at the core of masculinity is mission. It's a mission you're willing to die for. And so what I would say is I rather explain masculinity in the context of the creation mandate, in the mission that God was given to us to rule, reign, subdue, and be fruitful and multiply. And that has literal, like physical realities, get married, have babies, right? Actually shape mountains. And then it also has the greater spiritual sense where we're to make disciples, to preach the gospel, see people be saved. Really, the Great Commission is just the creation mandate for a fallen world, right? And to do all those things requires sacrifice, sweat of the brow, taking risks, being persecuted, being rejected, and all that. So I wouldn't want to make sacrifice. Sacrifice is like a means, but not the defining feature. And so why do why do children and women get off the boat first? Well, because legacy matters, because the mission matters, because the woman carries a man's heirs, his seed, his children, his progeny into the future. And the kids are another man's future. And we are willing to die for our children, just like a mother would be. But we're willing to die for the mother and children first, not because they're of greater value, but because of the mission that God has given us is how we're wired. And you see this with guys when they go into retirement, when they lose a sense of purpose and a sense of mission, they could be super sharp and then they just get old overnight, right? And they get depressed and whatever. And though you see a lot of retirees go right back into work, not always just for money, but to find a sense. Yeah. I think I would want to define masculinity in terms of fulfilling the creation mandate through our particular masculine abilities and tendencies. And that will require suffering. It will require hard work and death. Right. And so I wouldn't want to frame it exactly that way. I think sometimes we frame it that way. And I'm not saying this is what Doug's doing, but it is something an older generation seems to focus on, is that it's almost like just saying that since you're sacrificed, see, we're not big meanies, right? It's not, it's all about servanthood. And it is, but leadership and making decisions is servanthood too. Right? Making hard decisions and bearing the responsibility for your decisions is hard. And so I think we tried to balance that out. And one reason we did that is that there's a tendency with many modern men, we call them nice guys, from Robert Glover's book, No More Mr. Nice Guy, which I think is a really helpful book on the whole to understand masculine tendencies these days. Nice guys, though, think they create these covert contracts in their head with people. So they say, if I give this person what they want, they'll give me what I want, right? So a guy does the dishes, watches the kids, and then he says in his head, now my wife will have sex with me. It's like she almost owes him. But he never told this. He never told her this is why he was doing this. And then he resents her because she doesn't do that. Well, first off, those things are a blessing to the household, but they're not necessarily arousing, you know. I'm not aroused by my wife doing the dishes. Why should she be? You know, like, but the real problem there's a kind of this, if I give myself, you owe me, you'll give it back. And so I think there's a lot of guys that say, if I, throw my coat on the puddle for the woman to walk across, right, metaphorically speaking, then she'll like me, right? Well, she might appreciate you, but I don't know that she's going to like you in that way, in the way that you want. And I think there's a lot of guys wired like that, where they are willing to sacrifice themselves, but it's not for the glory of God. So when they sacrifice themselves, it builds up bitterness and resentment. You see this in a lot of young men, like, oh, I was so nice to her, right? Why she's always going out with these jerks or whatever? Well, because there's nothing attractive about that in of itself. And the other guy, it's not that he's a jerk. He's going somewhere and he wants to do something, and
He has a
woman
mission.
likes that. That's right. And so I think we make a big deal about mission in our book, and it's kind of like a big broad category. In one chapter, I forget which one, I think mission through duty. We give kind of a way to get started. Like, here's a few ways to think, a sort of paradigm or a grid. There's 1,000 ways to do it, but that's just one way. And because what we want guys to do is not the risk of when you focus on sacrifice and connect it to just women and children, is that you can pedestal in particular women and make women the focus, right? Like, what is the focus of creation? Is the focus of creation the church? No, I mean, the church is important. It's part of it. But when Jesus came to redeem them, he did redeem them for their own glory. It's exactly his glory presented to himself. That's what Ephesians says. And for some reason, we have a tendency to overlook that. And even Calvin warns about making too much of that passage in how we apply it to the marriage relationship. It's like it's there, but it's funny that that's become the go-to paradigm for this conversation. So anyway.
Yeah, it's good. What about so I was just curious, rites of passage for boys in modern times. Have you seen some good practices, or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, Non's got a lot of ideas about this because that's how his mind works. But for me, one, it's in our family, you get a knife when you turn 7. For our boys in particular, the girls want one, I'd probably give them one. So they get a big knife. And I say, don't cut yourself, and they always do. Then you get $150 whenever you memorize the shorter catechism. It's all yours. So
the whole catechism.
Mm-hmm.
Nice.
That's right. Okay. And they know, most of my kids have about 70, 80 questions memorized already, something like that.
Wow.
And so that's another one. For us, when you get your own job, you get a cell phone, right? It's a Gab wireless phone. So we don't give our kids anything that has a browser on it.
Yep. So
it's got a smart screen. You can take pictures, GPS, that sort of stuff. Gab wireless is GABB wireless. And it's like a step. So we've started creating some of these rites of passages that are connected to actual responsibility in real life. Mm-hmm. But I mean, we have lost a lot, and there is, I think, a lot of thought to put back into this. Other things, obviously, is when you get your driver's license, and the new responsibilities attached to that. These are things that are stepping into adulthood. Mm-hmm. And with my oldest son, he's going to go do an internship next year at my employer. And I want to continue that with each of my kids, having them do an internship as they get ready to prepare for vocational life, and make a big deal about it. Send them out there for 6 weeks, let them stay with a friend of mine, when they're 16, 17. Those are some of the things that we're working on.
Awesome. Do you have, as again, talking about applying these things, but there's some things that you would give advice to dads with sons? So obviously I'm, looking for advice, but I know there's a lot of them out there. Things to you need to run and avoid is when you're trying to raise a man as a dad.
So a couple of things. One is boys are fragile. They are fragile, emotionally fragile is what I have found, in a way that girls almost aren't. It's just funny enough. So I think it is, scripture warns, do not exasperate your children. Mm-hmm. And dads, we can do this to all our children. We can place burdens on them that we can never fulfill ourselves. We go too far with teasing, where it literally is a kind of form of bullying, where you're always looking down on them or whatever. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's really important to build a lot of encouragement into your kids. It can't be cheap. It can't be participation trophy stuff. But when they actually accomplish something, you want to praise them for it. You want to encourage them. You got this, son. You can do this. I think they need a lot of that. All your children do, but boys really do, especially in a society where masculinity is demonized. I think also you want to toughen them up. So I saw my son Cyprian once trying to carry something upstairs, and it was like almost too heavy for him. So like each step was like, ugh, and he would lift it into the step, and this, ugh. Well, my temptation is to help him.
Right.
But I didn't. I fought it because I started cheering him on. You got this, man. There's only 5 more steps. He almost quit. And I was like, no, one more. You got it. And then he got to the top, and I encouraged him. So I think don't coddle them, right? You want to help him, but when you see like he can do it, you want him to have that victory and then praise him for like overcoming adversity.
Right.
I think you also want to make sure that they touch and feel real things. You get them outside, teach them to shoot a gun, teach them to change the oil, teach them to do stuff, help them fall in love with the world of things that they're going to be required to have dominion over and to master. I got a half day today, and I got all sorts of stuff around this house I got to fix, right?
Yeah.
And so there's like cheap Home Depot cabinets I've learned to avoid. But I still own some, and I got to fix some that are broken. But introduce them to those things, like spend time with them fixing things. If you have a lot of kids, I think you have several like I do. You have what, 4 or 5?
No, just 3.
Oh, just 3. Okay. That's still the threes that where things really intensify, I feel like. But anyway, when you're trying to spend time with them, you can also just bring them with you to like Home Depot or to Lowe's or wherever you're going. Go pick up the mulch and bring them with you on business deals. Explain things to them. You want to like introduce them to the world. I got permission to bring my oldest son with me to a trade show.
Nice. And
so he can sit down and watch me talk about selling, negotiating $1 million contracts and things. I want him to see this. And so you want to bring them into your world. The big thing you don't want to do is ignore them. And let other people parent your kids. And I see Christians losing their children because we're allowing TikTok, YouTube streamers, Disney Plus to parent our children. And so you see this with homeschool families. They're so proud that they homeschool. Well, look, man, you have to have a stronger home culture, a stronger church culture, a counter culture, right? Not a subculture, but a counterculture. Subculture looks different on the outside, but really has all the same stuff on the inside. Counterculture might look the same on the outside, but has totally different motivations. And I think our churches, I'm watching churches that are post-millennial homeschoolers or Christian classic or classical Christian schools that believe all the right things, parents that do devotions, and their kids go out of the house and just like, bam, they're gone, apostate. Mm-hmm. It's like widespread right now. And every time I talk about it on Facebook, someone's like, well, that's why you should send your kids to public school. Well, they didn't. Well, they should read the Bible to them. Well, they did. Well, there's something wrong. Oh, maybe everything's not a simple formula, man. Yeah. Maybe it's that they weren't called to faith and that you did let them be parented by other people, and so but you can't just tell them no and not give them a yes. You can't create a vacuum. It's going to fill with something. And so I think you just pull them into your life. These divides between adults and children that we have now, it's like this multi-tiered divide is not historical, right? We really started to even think of children. There's a good book by Neil Postman on this. The idea, like you'd have 8-year-olds at bars, like in the Middle Ages, and it was really literacy where there's started to change the way we saw children, at least in the modern West. So I think we have to get back to bringing these young men and young women into the world of adults as soon as possible.
Awesome. Yeah, it's really, really good. Really helpful. Couple more things, as long as you have time. So we talked about mission and how this is, the way you would really want to describe masculinity. Do you think, so we know pornography is pervasive, it's more accessible than ever. So pornography and then boredom probably go somewhat hand in hand, at least a little bit. Do you, and then there's all these, here's how you fight pornography. Do you think just mission, right? Give them a mission. Do you think that is something that if we reorient that way, it would probably solve the boredom pornography problem?
I think it would help. I think once you start introducing screens to your kids, it's hard. There's this unlimited supply of entertainment, and once they're introduced to that, especially at a young age, the thought that they could actually not be bored is in their head. And I think about it as growing up, how often I was outside, like fighting trees and make out a sword and go out there and hit the trees. Imagine they were like a giant or something. Or chasing the cows on the farm. I used to actually, I'd go into the cow trough when it was really hot, and I'd hold my breath as long as I could. And I remember the cows coming up to drink, and me as like a little boy, just like shooting out of the water, and the cows like running backwards. I can remember in my teens, just going out to the levee. I grew up right on the Ohio River, and we'd go lay on the levee and look at the stars and see things and think and talk and chew and meditate. That is a sort of discipline that has to be taught. So maybe don't always listen to stuff, like don't always have don't always be glued to your phone as a parent. Don't always be in a car constantly consuming. I think the problem, what the connection between pornography and boredom is that pornography is you want to feed a desire, and you can't say no to it. There's a sort of consumerism to it, where with boredom is the ability to say no to consuming something, right? To go out and create something, create your own story, create your own fun, right? Just be alone with your own thoughts, digest, chew, throw around. And we have to recover boredom. We have to recover meditation. What I try to do is not listen to anything when I drive around town in my car.
Okay.
Now, when I go on long trips, I'll listen to audiobook. And in fact, if there's something I have to get done for a meeting, I'll listen to it. But I try just to not have the radio on or anything. It's really helpful. And to be alone with my thoughts, and a lot of great thoughts come to you. But I think that learning to be by yourself is super important. And I think pornography is trying to make a connection, to solve a hunger, and it's terribly, it twists it. And what it does, it keeps you from, like, a lot of guys aren't having sex in their marriage because they're not asking, right? Like, have you ever asked your wife, I'd like to have sex tonight? Well, I don't feel like I should. Well, that's why you're probably not having sex. Maybe, like, I mean, you don't always have to, but sometimes if you just ask, she'll say yes because she loved you and married you, right? I've told guys before who were struggling with pornography. I had one guy, a good man, who, and it was very light battle with pornography. But I asked him, like, when are you most tempted? And he said the middle of the night. And he doesn't want to inconvenience his wife. And I was like, oh, just wake her up and say, let's have sex, right? Just wake her up. She loves you. She'll probably have sex with you, right? Maybe not every time, but the majority of the time. He did. And it was like, yeah, it worked. And I was like, yeah, she loves you. She'd rather you be with her than look at some chick online, man. Like, just ask. And so when you do pornography, it keeps you from even asking. It does lessen your desire, right? And for single guys, it keeps them pacified and from them out there and creating and doing things and going after an actual woman. And it creates a false sense of satisfaction that comes from you looking at pixels and touching yourself, right? It's very weak.
Right. It's good. Very helpful. Now, kind of married with that, pun intended, how, one of the things popular is men go their own way, right? I'm sick and tired of this feminine culture. it's doing nothing but tearing me down. It's completely against me as a man. And so I'm done with it. I will, and the pagan side of that is I'll just use women when I want to, and then whatever. But from a Christian perspective, a lot of times we see marriage is a necessity to bring masculinity to its full potential, for lack of a better term. Do you agree? Do you have some thoughts on the necessity of marriage? I know you ended the book with, kind of talking about marriage.
Yeah. So we didn't want a book that defined manhood by womanhood. And I wouldn't want to define womanhood by manhood, but certainly not men, because men were made first and the created order has significance. And that's the argument that the Apostle Paul, inspired by the Holy Spirit, makes. Okay.
Amen.
But we didn't want to do it that way. And I do think you can be single and have a lot of those male attributes develop into maturity. Same for women as well. However, what's normative throughout history and throughout scripture is men and women pursuing marriage together. And women actually get married more than men do throughout history. A lot of men die before they get a chance to get married. Seems that there's genetic evidence that only 20% of the men that ever existed created progeny. Wow. So yeah, it's pretty wild. I don't know how true that is or not, but you can think of like in ancient times, like where there wasn't antibiotics and there was I was thinking about, man, how precious water would be and how I just use it to wash pans off. And I was like, I didn't have water. How would I clean a pan? I had not really thought about that, but anyhow, so I think marriage is a massive amplifier for men and women. It's funny, as a pastor, you see this. Mm-hmm. You see Driscoll, Driscoll's went off the deep end, but he used to say men are like trucks. The more weight you put on them, the straighter they drive. And I was talking to my assistant pastor, and he was telling me you can be pretty particular. He's been tracking his net worth since before he was married. And he said when he got married and with each kid, his net worth went up more and more. And there's a sort of focus that marriage brings to a man. Now you got people that really depend on you, right? And a lot of guys are willing to travel light through life. I was, before I was married, I rented a room from some hippie pot smoking guy, and I had an inflatable mattress on the ground that had a slow leak in it. So I'd fill it up at night and try to go to sleep before all the air got out. Right. And wake up and put the same jeans and t-shirts on that I wore, man. I was like a standard dude and then work as a landscaper. And, it's like guys can travel light. Women, when we get our first apartment, it's like we get our TV figured out, our entertainment, and then there's a box that we're eating at. So, and that's different. And so women come in and so the guy with the responsibility gets more. But then it's crazy. Women do come in and fill your house with nice things, right? Em's always, she actually set up my office for me downstairs. It looks great. She bought all these bookshelves down here and upstairs, set up my desk. It's awesome.
All this back here. That's not a bit of me.
They're a huge blessing. And this is part of homemaking, right? Yeah. It's like an atmosphere. It's a way of life. They create a place for hospitality. They create a place where your children can be nurtured, where the disciples can be made, where friendships can blossom, all that stuff. This is what women do. So I think marriage also transforms women. I've seen a lot of women. It's funny. They get married and they were pretty beforehand, but they get married and they go off to their honeymoon and they come back and there's a sort of shine to them, and you can tell they feel beautiful. Right, they let their hair down, so to speak, and I've just noticed where they start using a little bit more makeup. They start dressing a little bit nicer, and it's because they receive the willing love of a man, right? And they feel beautiful. They feel desired, and a woman should feel desired. I always think when I hear these guys "Well, I didn't marry her for her beauty." Well, don't tell her that. She wants to feel beautiful. That's messed up. You marry her for her whole person, of which part of that is her physical beauty. Come on, man. And so I think when men and women marry, it adds fuel to the fire. It matures them much quicker. It forces all the issues that come to surface.
Yeah.
You know, there's a great quote: marriage is the white hot searchlight of the soul.
That's good.
And you, all the problems come to the surface, but that's how you start to get those things out. And so if you have Christ and you have a community around you, you're able to weather the storm of the early marriage. I always tell people this: both the sex of your early marriage and a lot of your communication is the worst that it's ever going to be, right? It's going to actually get way better. But the beauty of it is you don't usually know. Because like contextually, you're like, oh, this is fun, this feels great, or we're doing pretty good. But then like 15 years down the road, you look back, you say, I didn't know how to be a lover.
Yep.
I didn't know how to love her. She didn't know how to love me yet. We didn't talk well. We didn't solve, like, because you grow and you mature and you look back on it and you just think, whew. And I always remember that because, you know, we got these like 19-year-olds getting married and you always look at them and you're like, they ain't ready. And then you're like, oh, I wasn't ready either. You know, like not completely. It's kind of like, look, basic training, AIT, and you can go fight a war. Are you ready for a war? Well, you're prepped. You're not ready till you get there. And so I think once you hop into a marriage, it forces the issues and it does grow. It is a great amplifier of your sexuality. Is it required? Well, I don't think so, but I think that's aberrant and not normative. And so most of us should get married.
Yeah, I was not expecting it to do that really. I was in Bible college when I met Erica, and then we got married, and I was, you know, becoming an adult on my own, really trying to do it for myself, not connected with my mom and dad at the time. And so I was already responsible all by myself, but it's true. I tell people this all the time. Once I got married, though, it was some kind of switch flipped, something. I don't know what, but yeah, it was that heavy load, the responsibility kicked in, the grace of God just, it was incredible. And I thank God every day for that because I can't point to anything other, you know, anything else in my life other than I just got married.
It's helpful, yeah.
But yeah, super helpful. Well, I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but I want to let you plug future projects. I know people are going to say, right, it's good to be a man. You totally hate women, right? They play the zero-sum game with everything you say. And I know those who disagree with the book are many. And there's some pretty fun meme wars going on and things like that. So do you have anything you want to say to maybe those who are turned off instantly? And then also, you got any future projects you want to point people to?
I'd just say actually read the book. I mean, if you're offended by the idea of the book, I don't have anything to say to you. If the idea that it's good to be a man is offensive to you, I think you're the problem, right? Scripture says it. Scripture says that God made man and woman in his image and it's good. And if you, like you said, the zero-sum game, if it's good to be a man, that means it's bad to be a woman, then you've fallen for this war on sex, this war on gender that I don't subscribe to. I feel like I mostly have to respond to people for things the book never said or they thought it should say. And if they want to write a book, they should do it. I recommend it. And I just say judge the book on its own merits. Just before I got on with you, I was writing a response to a review, and I was like, basically, this review says almost nothing about the book, and it just like wants to connect me to a patriarchal movement that I was never part of. You know, that I think our book talks about good patriarchy versus evil patriarchy. I think we try to change the nature of the dialogue. I would say that there's a lot of hurt women out there, and a lot of hurt men. You mentioned the MGTOW movement. That's where guys lost their children to a woman that was unfaithful to them in many cases. And therefore now they hate women. I think there's women that have suffered underneath the reign of a tyrannical, abusive man, and now they hate men. So it's kind of like if you keep getting bit by Dobermans, I understand why I don't trust Dobermans, but the problem might not be Dobermans. It might just be the ones that came in your life. And so I get where these people come from, but their brokenness, their experience, I'm not going to read the whole world through it. That's not how it works. You read it through scripture, and they need to not treat what's abnormal as normal. So I'd say that. In terms of future projects, Oh, I got a lot in the hopper. I always do. I started a book that I'm hoping to finish this year called Surviving the Death of a Daughter, which is about, it's a collection of blog posts, journal entries, kind of reordered, that walk someone through about the first year after, walk through the death of Nicaea to the end of the first year, and then ends with looking back 10 years later on what we learned from it. It's a pretty short book. It's about half done. And then we talked about a trilogy of books, but I'm not going to write a book on fatherhood till I have Christian grandchildren. I just think it's stupid. I can say some things on fatherhood right now, and I can add to people in it. I know some things, but to write a book on fatherhood without Christian grandchildren, to me, strikes me as premature. Like, let's say you've done it first. Okay. Right. Like let's raise them into adulthood where they're actually now following, hopefully, your good example. So I don't really want to do it's good to be a man, it's good to be a husband, it's good to be a father, as we originally thought we might, because it's good to be a father is, 10 years off at least. And I don't know if I want to keep doing this all the time. So what I'm actually told Nam we should do, we'll see if he does it, I'm going to start it one way or another, is it's not good to be alone, or it's not good that man be alone. And I think it'd work as a great sequel. So it's good to be a man, a basic argument for marriage, in favor of marriage. I'm talking about, but not recreate reforming marriage or something like that, but look at it through the modern problems and make an argument that contradicts MGTOW, contradicts the singleness put forward by Gospel Coalition, as scripture contradicts both. Marriage is to be held in high honor, and it is normative, but also walk through where some things that we think haven't been taught on, like there's a great need for sexuality to be, or actual sex, erotic sex, to be dealt with. There's books like Intended for Pleasure by Ed Wheat that kind of serve that spot, but it's old. And I do recommend the first couple chapters. Emily and I have a joke, has a book in it, or a chapter in it called Sex in Their 70s. And we're like, oh, I don't want to read that. That sounds disgusting. But then I told her, we're going to be 70 someday. We're like, all right, let's read this chapter, blow the dust off. But I think writing a book that deals with some of those issues, on choosing a wife, on managing disagreements, how do we navigate a 2-income world, a 2-career world? We can say, oh, you just don't. Well, sometimes you already got married and you built a whole life around 2 incomes, and including your mortgage. And it's not like you can just stop, right, without there being catastrophic. It's kind of like when you're driving really quick, you just can't hit the brakes without there being everything moving in a bad way. So that's probably the next book on manhood. County for Country is our conference, September 1st through 3rd. Brian Sauvé is going to be down here oppressing women. John Moody's coming again. Aaron Wren's coming again. And Doug's thinking about it. So we'll see if that happens.
Nice. That's awesome. The book, It's Not Good to Be Alone, just thinking about a Christian take on kind of the pickup artist, and really, how do you find a wife? How do you go about doing that, but in a Christian way and not in the servant leadership way? There might be a huge market.
There's like 20,000 words on that already written that was for this book. And then we realized that it didn't fit. And now there's a lot of content that we have out there that we haven't published. Awesome.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Michael. I really appreciate it. This is really helpful, and I hope many find it helpful. Where can people find you? Social media? Where do you want to point them?
Batavia, Ohio. That's where you can find me. East River Church. We meet every Sunday. Come hear the word of God. If you really want to follow me on social media, I'm most active on Twitter at @ThisIsFoster.
All right. Beautiful. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for listening. Again, share, subscribe, do all that helpful stuff to get us in front of new listeners. Share this episode with someone who you think would benefit greatly from it. And I appreciate it if you do. Until next time, take hold and reorder creation by first reforming your home. This has been the Reformed Reset.
But on the basis of grace and on the finished work of Jesus Christ, the project is back and forth. And the destiny of a new transformed world is assured.
I just put the sourdough in the oven too, so I've got like 40 minutes.